Have you told your friends that you see ghosts?
Oh, absolutely not.
Gina Rodriguez returns in Not Dead Yet.
I'm back, baby.
Who is that?
Oh, she's the obituary writer.
And Brad Garrett joins the brilliant ensemble cast.
Titan, Maverick, Titan of all Mavericks. These are all words used to describe me.
Not Dead Yet. Season premiere. Tonight, 8:30, 7:30 Central on ABC. And stream on Hulu.
How often have you struggled to know what to say when someone close to you is going through grief at the loss of a loved one? What do you say? How do you convey your compassion, your awareness of the enormous loss? This podcast contains some mature themes. Listener discretion is advised. I've heard myself say, there are just no words. So many times. Many people have chosen to say nothing at all because, well, what's the right thing to say? Or everything happens for a purpose. Or they're in a better place right now. Colin Campbell is the author of Finding the Words. It's a book about working through profound loss with hope and purpose. And he makes the argument that the way our society treats grief is not just backward, it's cruel. He, of all people, knows. In 2019, Colin, his wife Gail, and their 2 teenage kids were driving late one night when a drunk and high driver going almost 150 kilometres an hour T-boned them. Colin and Gail survived. Their 2 children, Ruby and Hart, did not. How does anyone live through that? And after that? But perhaps just as important to discuss, how are we to best support a friend, a colleague, a brother, a sister, a grieving mother or father who literally does not know how to go on after a tragic or profound loss? Life brings grief. That's a human reality, especially if we've loved well. I recorded today's conversation with Colin and how he survived such a loss about 3 weeks ago. Just last week, my own family experienced tragedy. My nephew, Logan, died by suicide. He had just turned 20. With the best and kindest of intentions, I heard people say, there are no words, over and over and over again to me. In his book, Colin says, there are no words is the perfect conversation killer. It immediately ends any chance of a dialogue about grief. It's telling the mourner that we can't really discuss their grief because there are no words that would be applicable. This empty phrase encapsulates all that is wrong in how our society handles grief. This is perhaps the most powerful and important conversation that we have ever had on the Happy Families podcast. And it offers a far more practical and helpful approach to grief, to what we normally see. It's an important discussion and one that we need. And we're breaking format. This is not a conversation for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. This is a conversation that we need to have. And it will take as long as it takes. Please join me. We'll be right back. Colin, thanks for joining me for this conversation. Before we talk about what happened, I'd really like to honour your family. To me, they're the main show in your life. They're the main show in your book, even though it's a book about grief. Can you tell me, please, about your wife and your children?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me, by the way, Justin. I appreciate it. So my wife is a comedy writer and also now a comedy director for television. So she's very funny. And humor has always been part of our relationship in our lives. And we raised Ruby and Hart to be, they love a good joke as well. So it was a very fun-loving and comedic-centric family. And so Hart, I always think of him as like a clown. He was just a performer. He would just embody these characters who were always outrageous, totally over the top, almost alien-like. And they were hilarious. Ever since he was a little kid, he would just play these characters. And he was known for them on the schoolyard. So people would request them. So like, oh, can you play so-and-so? And he would become these characters. And they were all larger than life and ridiculous. And it started with Ruby because she was the director. So she initially would put him into clothes, costumes, wigs, dresses, heels, and send him into the living room to perform for us.
Who's the older of the two? So how
she
old?
is Ruby.
Yeah, and what's the age difference?
Ruby's 3 years and 1 day older than Hart.
Wow.
So the birthday was 1 day apart. So hers was March 29th and his was March 30th. So 3 years and a day later. And they were an amazing team, and they squabbled. Of course they squabbled. But they also loved each other. And they were extraordinarily kind. And so Ruby was an artist, and Hart was her biggest fan. Everything she did, he thought was just amazing. And he was so earnest and honest with her. And she'd show him, a drawing, and he would just be like, "Oh my God, Ruby, that is amazing." It's just like beautiful. See this 14-year-old boy just gushing over his big sister's artwork. And she was bullied in middle school. She had a hard time. She was struggling with OCD and depression, and she was like, she became a target for anybody that wanted to bully somebody because she seemed so vulnerable, right? And middle school kids, they attack the vulnerable kids. But then something beautiful happened. She owned and embraced her own sexuality. She came out. She became this proud, I call her a lesbian warrior for social justice, because she was very social justice minded. And she became so cool and so confident that not only did all the bullying stop, but in fact, people bullying other people stopped around her because she'd be like, "Knock it off. Don't bully that little kid just because he's a nerd." And they wouldn't because she was so cool. And that was a beautiful thing to see her come into her own. It was quite extraordinary.
As I listen to you describe your children and your wife, it really sounds like the perfect family. The white picket fence, the smiling children. It sounds so blissful. It sounds like it's the dream.
Yes, except there was that struggle with OCD and depression. That was very serious. So that was suicidality, and it was not all bliss for sure. But luckily, at the very end of her life, she did come out of that. We got the right medication, the right therapists, and then it really was. To my mind, I had the greatest family in the world. My kids were the coolest. Honestly, that's how I felt. My kids are the coolest kids in the world. My wife's the coolest wife in the world. Yeah, in that sense, absolutely.
The way you say it with a smile just makes it even more real. Colin, June 12, 2019, it must be a date that creates enormous emotions for you. What can you tell us about the events of that day?
Yeah. Well, in a way, the evening leading up to it was sort of the apogee of this perfect, blissful family, because we were on our way to Joshua Tree. It's one of our favorite places on earth, the four of us. We love scrambling these amazing rock formations out in the high desert. It's like 2.5 hours east of Los Angeles. Very sparsely populated, extraordinary vistas in every direction. It's just really beautiful, beautiful place. And we had just put down an offer on a house, like a getaway shack, we called it, on the side of the hill with amazing views. So the house is very simple, but the views were extraordinary. That's all we really wanted. And all four of us loved it. We were so excited. It was like a dream come true. We could actually have our own place out there in the desert. And we were driving there, and it was wonderful. It was like the school had just ended. The school year had ended. Ruby and Hart's work was all done. They were thrilled. We were thrilled. And on the way, a drunken high driver going 90 miles an hour T-boned the car. And Ruby and Hart were killed in the back seat. And Gail and I were wounded, but not that seriously. Certainly, it was surreal how okay we were compared to the fact that our children were gone.
It sounds like you've just climbed the mountain. It sounds like everything was there, and in one unexpected second, it's not. There are so many different questions that I have describe or ask you to describe the aftermath of what's happened. What I'm most interested in when I think about how I would react as a father with 6 daughters, how do you, I don't know if traverse is the right word, but I'll use it. How do you traverse the days and the weeks following the crash? How do you walk into the house for the first time? How do you walk past their bedroom for the first time? It's the little things. How do you sit down at the dining table with Gail and have a meal for the first time, knowing that this is the new reality, that you don't have your kids anymore?
The terror is the first thing that comes to mind. We were terrified to walk back into our house, coming back from the hospital. And that was surprising to me. I didn't understand why I was so scared.
I'd want to go and check into a hotel. I can't imagine walking into the house and feeling the emptiness.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's like, and I know some people who sell their home after they lose their child, but in a way, we couldn't, because Ruby and Hart's stuff were there. Ruby was there. Hart was there. Our memories, they grew up in that house. They were born in that house. And so how could we leave? And so there's this dual thing happening. It's like, we need to be in this house, and yet everywhere in the house reminds us of what's gone, what's been taken from us. And it's so painful. It's so painful and scary. And so, in fact, you mentioned sitting at the dining room table, and that was really hard. We had Gail's sisters took turns coming out and staying with us. They're both on the East Coast, Nina and Betsy, and they took turns staying with us just so that we could, when we sat down at the dining room table, it wasn't just the two of us, because it was too awful. We couldn't take it, the thought of sitting down at that table and just be the two of us. So really terror was uppermost in my mind. And then the aching, the horrible aching. And the aching stays with me. I'm not as terrified now, but the aching for them is very difficult. Yeah. To endure. Yeah.
You write that a profound loss is, and I'm quoting from the book here, a profound loss is when you lose someone who you feel is entwined intrinsically with your own identity. In other words, you define yourself partly in terms of this other person, close quote. So I think this is the thing that struck me most. Your sense of self is that you're a dad. That's who you are. And in this impossibly, well, it's not impossible to describe, but in this incredibly cruel moment, that identity is forever altered. Every time you meet somebody for the first time and they say, so tell me about your family. Have you got kids? You must have you have to think so hard about how you're going to answer that. How do you bring this up? How do you talk about profound loss and identity, and particularly what it meant for you? Like, again, the question, I guess, is how do you process this from an identity standpoint?
Two things I want to sort of talk about. I hope that I can remember, but the identity is really central to me. And I like this definition that I came up with for profound loss, because I feel like it's generous in the sense that the griever gets to decide if it's a profound loss, right? Somebody loses their parent and somebody else doesn't have a close relationship to their parent, and they think it's no big deal. But to the one person who lost their parent, maybe it is. Maybe it's a central idea of who they are. They are so-and-so's son or daughter. That's how they identify. So I like that the griever decides what's profound, not somebody else, It's who they think is important to who they are as a human. And then to have that gone for me was so destabilizing, because I literally, while they were alive, I defined myself as Ruby and Hart's dad. It wasn't suddenly after they were gone. That's who I was. I took such pride in being their dad. I was so proud of them. It was so important to who I was as a human. And then they were gone, and I couldn't, at first I couldn't accept it, that I was the father of 2 dead children. I was so resistant to that. But then as my grief evolved, it changed, it shifted, and I kind of clung to that identity. It became important to me because it was like, I need to honor Ruby and Hart at all times. So I'm Colin Campbell. I'm the father of 2 children who were killed by a drunk driver. They're named Ruby and Hart. That was my identity suddenly. And that was important to me, that I acknowledge it. And I like the sort of the PSA quality to it, right? If I'm talking to somebody and they hear this, maybe that could save a life, because maybe they'll think twice next time before they drink and drive. And, I don't know. But then as time progressed even further, I had to shift my identity again. And each shift was painful to me. It was hard to to change. But now I don't think of myself primarily as the father of 2 dead children. It's a central part of my identity, but it's not necessarily the first thing that I say when I meet somebody new. You know what I mean? Whereas before it was really important. On the first day of class, I'm a professor. And so on the first day of class, I tell my students, I'm Colin Campbell and I'm grieving the loss of my 2 children. They were killed by a drunk driver. And so, which was intense to tell students on the first day, but I had to. It was too important to me, right? And now I don't have to. And that's also hard. It's hard to let go of that, in a way. It's like every stage of this evolving identity has pain involved in it, I think.
You want so much to honor them and to highlight that they are still part of your life. And yet over time, I mean, it's been over 4 years now. I guess what I'm hearing you say is the relevance of that conversation to the lives of the people you're interacting with may not be quite as substantive as you gave it more weight earlier on.
Yeah, I was more like, I need to tell you right now. And now I think it all the time. I think about Ruby and Hart all the time, but I don't need to tell you necessarily about them all the time. Does that make sense? Like my need for it is quieted.
This is a time thing, right? Like there is a process, there's an evolution with grief. I'd imagine that the acuteness of what was happening in those first days, weeks and months must be so different to the passage of time allowing you to be 4 years down the track and even say what you're saying with me.
Yeah. And I think it's not just time, because I don't think that time heals all wounds. I don't think it heals any of my wounds, but I have changed. My relationship to pain and grief has changed, but I think it's because of the time I spent engaged in my grief. In other words, I think if people are avoiding grief, then they're not progressing through. In a way, you can be stuck, and time can pass, but it doesn't change anything. You know what I mean?
Well, that's where
I don't think it's a magical balm.
Yeah, that's exactly where I want to take it now. But I don't want to talk about how the griever either avoids or steps into their grief. I want to talk about the people who are around you and their avoidance of grief, which in many ways is where the book begins. And I think it was what really struck me. You take a very, very strong and direct approach to people who are around you in terms of advocating for your needs as you go through this grief process. Through the book, you're very courageous with others and also with yourself in some really challenging ways. The emails that you write, the way that you talk to people about things. One example, right after your only 2 children in the world are killed, you point to what would be called what you call the grief orthodoxy. And you make the point that people, well-intentioned people, would say things like, I couldn't live if that happened to me. I'd kill myself. Yeah. Or they'd say, Colin, there are no words. There are no words, which is something that I know that I've said before. And when I read it in your book, I felt very guilty about it. There is a question here. The question is this. Your response to that in the book was so impactful for me. I'd love for you to talk about what your reaction is to those comments, because you didn't kill yourself and there are words.
No. Yeah. So I do want to make clear, I don't want you to feel bad about saying that. I think some people, I wrote an op-ed in the Atlantic, and some people were like, these people are just trying to be nice. Why are you scolding them? And I never scolded anybody, just for the record. Anybody that said that to me, I never said like, hey, don't say that to me.
Sure. Because
I knew what they were saying, why they were saying it. It made a lot of sense. You're saying there are no words because you're trying to express the depths of the horror that I'm in, and it's apt to say I there are no words that I can say that's going to touch the horror of your reality. But what happened was I was told that so many times in early grief, so many times, literally hundreds of times, people would say there are no words to me, and very often the conversation would end there. That would be it, because there are no words. And I needed to talk about my grief. I needed to talk about Ruby and Hart. And so I started to think, because I'm kind of a contrarian, I have to admit. And so if 200 people say there are no words to me, I'm going to be like, wait a minute, is that true? Are there really no words? And I found, no, there are words. There are people who come up to me and they talk about Ruby and Hart, or they ask me about my grief, how my grief is doing that moment, and we can have a conversation about it. And nobody's finding the perfect words. Nobody's finding words that are going to that are going to solve my problem. That no one can fix my pain. No one can take away my pain. No one can even give me comfort, honestly. But to be able to talk about Ruby and Hart and my grief to somebody, especially somebody who knew them, is transformative in my experience of grief. I feel like I'm not alone. I feel like there are other people who are grieving them. We can talk about that. And it helps me immensely.
For somebody who is grieving, how does a friend approach them? What do we say? What are the words?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I think so many of the words that come off wrong are words that are attempting to give comfort. Because if you're trying to comfort somebody, on some level, you're trying to take away their pain. You're trying to tell them, maybe stop crying now, right? And in fact, I believe a person who has lost a loved one inevitably is going to feel pain. They need to feel that pain. It's the flip side of love. If you love someone so deeply and they're gone from earth, they're gone from your life, you have to allow yourself to feel the pain of that loss in order just to be present, in this life without them. Otherwise, you're in denial. That's another way to go, where you can compartmentalize and pretend it didn't happen or pretend you're not thinking about it. And there's always that temptation, and we all do that, me included. But I feel like being allowed to express my pain is so helpful. And so if someone's saying things like, they're trying to comfort me, like, oh, they're in a better place, or well, you could adopt other kids, or some kind of replacement, or at least you had 17 years with Ruby and 14 with Hart. Those are all sort of nice things, but the unstated implication is, so stop grieving so much. Right?
Everything happens for a reason, Colin.
Yeah, everything happens for a reason. So maybe you can stop your grieving, and those seem very unhelpful to me. So the most helpful things that I've encountered were people who are simply sharing Ruby and Hart stories, or sharing how much they love Ruby and Hart and miss them, or how much they love me, and want to spend time with me, even though I'm grief-stricken and maybe not so friendly or palatable. Or also if they're asking me about my grief, how is my grief today? Acknowledging that when I wake up this morning, I had a hard time because I had to deal with the thought that, yep, another day and Ruby and Hart are still gone, but I got to get out of bed. Well, I was gonna address your other question, which is about the I would just die, right? My kids would be killed out. I would just die, and I heard that several times, and that felt very unhelpful to me. Because on the one hand, it felt to me that the implication was, if they must love their kids more than I love my kids, because if their kids died, they would just kill themselves, and I didn't, so I must not really love my kids as much, right? That's the implication. And the truth is, you don't really just spontaneously die. You would have to actively end your life. And here I am in grief, seeing how awful it is to endure such painful loss. If I ended my life, what would that do to my wife or my mom or my brother or sister, all the people that love me? How could I intentionally, and Ruby and Hart were murdered, how could I intentionally take my own life and plunge my whole community into more grief? And also, how is that going to honor Ruby and Hart? I want to stay alive so I can honor Ruby and Hart. And that was a thought that I had, was like, if I died and people that love me killed themselves, I'd be bummed. I'd be like, wait, no, so you stay alive. You're supposed to tell Colin stories, right? You're supposed to stay alive and talk about me. So, and then on top of that was Ruby's suicidality. So she struggled with suicidality, and in a sense, she overcame that. You don't just overcome depression, but she had it managed. She wanted to live. She fought for her life, and I couldn't dishonor her memory and her struggle by taking my own life. So it felt like to me, when people made that comment, "Oh, I would just kill myself," it felt very flippant. It felt like they weren't really thinking about it in a deep, deep way. They were just saying it. It felt easy for them to say that. And it's not easy for me. I have to actually think about it. You know what I mean? It's like, dude, I actually have to think about, do I end my life or not? And I have to think about what that means to other human beings. And it's a rough road either way. And you just sort of saying, I would just kill myself is offensive to me, because you have the privilege, not you, but the person who said that to me has a privilege of just sort of tossing it off as opposed to actually thinking about the reality. Yeah.
You've been through an experience that most people would not actually be able to really step into and imagine enduring. So much so that you've gone and written a book about, number one, the grief process and how it exists in our culture at the moment. And I think that you're actually quite strong on saying that we do not handle it in healthy ways right now in our culture at all. I'm wondering if this was something that you grew up with. Were you always grief aware? And the reason I ask it is because I've written blog posts and articles and done podcasts on topics like this, and I think that I've been empathic and given good advice, but the profundity in what you've said and your solutions and strategies, the way that you've honoured your children and honoured your grief, but also shown other people a roadmap through their grief, seems particularly, well, it's deep. It's just so thoughtful. I'm just curious whether your background taught you that.
No, absolutely not. The exact opposite.
Right.
My family upbringing was, I call it grief averse. So we did not talk about grief much at all, honestly.
So no religious background or anything like that?
Right. No. So my parents were raised as Protestants, and they rebelled in their 20s and were atheists, are atheists. My father passed away, and they raised us without, any kind of religion. And all three of us, I have a brother and sister, older brother and sister, we're all very happy atheists. We enjoy our lack of belief in a supreme being. But here, when it came time to grieve, that tradition for me didn't have any cultural tools for managing grief. So I leaned heavily on the Jewish traditions.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, hearing you describe your background makes me even more intrigued, because in the book you talk about how your community came together. I wondered to what extent the Jewish faith, which your wife Gail is Jewish, how much that community and that faith actually provided some kind of, a rock, a foundation, a framework, a way forward for you. Could you talk about the way religion, even though you don't have a religious bone in your body, religion actually, I guess, shepherded you through this grief process?
Honestly, because I'm a religious, so it wasn't the religious component, but more the cultural component. And I think it sort of helped me because it helped me to analyze what these Jewish traditions were really about for me, because they're all on one level about God, but for me, they're not at all about God. They're about how do you process grief. And I figured, Jews had thousands of years to think about this and work it out. And if there are rules about grieving, I bet there's practical reasons for them. And sure enough, it felt very practical to me. All the customs and traditions that I was exposed to all had deep practical meaning for me that literally taught me how to grieve. So the whole idea of even grieving in community, that's from the Jewish traditions. So just to name a few of them, you have to say the mourner's Kaddish. It's a prayer for the dead, but you are not allowed to say it alone. You have to say it with at least 9 other people present.
And when do you say this? When do you say this mourner's Kaddish?
We're supposed to say it every day for the first year.
With 9 other people present.
Yes. Now, we didn't say it every day. We went weekly. And there are different rules for different losses as well. So, and again, I'm not a rabbi, so I think technically for child loss, it's not every day. But this is either the point. The idea is that you grieve with people. So inevitably, I'm saying this prayer in Hebrew, and there are people amening me, and I'm going to weep, right? I can't get through the mourner's Kaddish, especially in early grief, without crying. I have to do it with people standing around me with love. And isn't that beautiful? Isn't that sort of the opposite of what was certainly the opposite of what I conceived of grief, which is you go away in a corner and you're just sad by yourself, right? That's what is in the movies.
Eat a lot of ice cream and hide under the blankets watching Netflix.
Yeah, exactly. That's what everybody thinks, or get really, really drunk or really, really high. And the Jewish tradition is like, no, actually, you got to be present. You have to be engaged in your grief. You can't compartmentalize, because every day you're going to show up and grieve with people around watching you, and amening your shared grief. And it's so beautiful. It's such a powerful experience to be supported in that moment over and over again. And the other example that I'll just share is the notion of Shiva. So Shiva is the first 7 nights after the funeral. People gather at your house. They come to your house and they literally sit with you. That's so-called sitting Shiva. And Shiva is Hebrew for 7, so it's the first 7 nights. And so each night, hundreds of people would come crowd our house.
Which sounds burdensome.
Yes, it does, right? It sounded terrible to me. I was like, what are you talking about? Reuben Hart were just killed like 72 hours ago. And now you want people to pack into my home? But I was like, well, I'm just going to listen to the Jews because they know better. And sure enough, they do. And so I was very grateful that I did just listen to them and do what they told me, the rabbi told me to do. Because then our wise rabbi, Sharon Browse, she turned to us and said, these people are gathered here. Do you have anything you want to say to them? And it turned out I did. I desperately wanted to talk about Reuben Hart. And all these people wanted to hear about Reuben Hart. And they wanted to talk about Reuben Hart. And so it was amazing. I could tell Reuben Hart stories. We could laugh and cry. And then I'd hear stories from other people. And it was like, oh, yeah, we're mourning in community. This is how one grieves. I don't sit in a corner and eat ice cream and get drunk. I'm here with people who love Reuben Hart and me. And we can share stories and we can laugh and cry together. So those are all just huge eye-openers for me. As
I read the book and came across this idea of Shiva, which I'd never heard of before, it made me envious. I don't know if there's a better word for it. I think about the funeral traditions. I have a faith background, but my funeral traditions feel just so lacking relative to what you described. This idea that you're going to have a huge community, then you're going to do a sitting Shiva for 7 nights where literally 100 plus people are showing up and finding a space in your house and doing this. And then there was another tradition as well, which I don't remember the name of it, but at the end of Shiva, with the community, there's something really substantial that happens there as well.
Yeah. You take a walk around the block, and it's so powerful on so many levels, because sure enough, that first week, Gail and I were scared to leave the house.
And you don't, so do you? Isn't that tradition, like you're not supposed to leave the house or something?
No, I don't believe that you're necessarily restricted to the house.
Okay.
But we felt restricted. We felt like scared to go out into the world. And sadly, we had to for some doctor appointments. But aside from the doctor appointments and the therapy appointments, we stayed in our house. And it was scary to us. And then on the last day of Shiva, it's like, oh, we're all going to walk around the block together. We're going to accompany you around the block. And it was like we're reintroducing you to the world.
So like 100 people. 200 people.
Walking down these small side streets of Silver Lake, and we blocked traffic. That was it. No car could go in the side street while we're walking, 100 people. And that was powerful. Because in a way it felt like transgressive. Like, yeah, Ruby and Hart are dead, and we're going to take up space. We're going to demand attention, and we're not going to shy away from this. We're going to break some rules for Ruby and Hart because their loss is catastrophic. And I remember a car pulled up ahead of us and saw this crowd and started honking. And my brother ran over to the car and said what was happening. And they just whoop, and they just backed away. Because it's like, right, there's 100 people in grief coming down the road. We don't care about your appointment that you're late for. Back up. It's grief. And it demands space. It's pretty beautiful.
When I hear you talk about it, it feels, like you said, transgressive. It feels empowering. It's almost like you're saying, I'm going to reclaim my agency. I'm going to reclaim my capacity to start to take steps forward, to expand my universe again. despite the awfulness of the tragedy. You described a metaphor. In fact, I think it was your rabbi who told it to you, but you described in the book the metaphor of the shipwreck. When I hear about this Shiva tradition and I hear about various other things that you did with community, which probably go well beyond the scope of our conversation now, but they're in the book and they're beautiful. I wonder if you can describe for me the metaphor of the shipwreck.
Yeah. So she shared that at the funeral itself. And I have to just give props to our amazing Rabbi Sharon Brous. She's just an extraordinary human being. And she held our hands figuratively and literally for those first days of awfulness and took us to pick out the casket, right? To pick out the caskets, plural, to pick out the burial spot. So some rough days, and she was there for us, and continues to be there for us. But at the funeral, she shared this story about, and again, it's from I forget where it's from, but Jews have lots of stories. They love beautiful metaphoric stories. But in this story, there's a shipwreck, and somebody clings to a piece of wood that floats by, and that's how they survive. And you go under the water and back out, under and out, and you're holding on, you're clinging to this piece of wood floating by. And she said to Gail and I want you to look out to this room and see all these people, and they're all going to be planks of wood for you to cling to, because your life's been wrecked. And that was powerful, and that was a beautiful introduction to our community, to be like, you guys are going to be the planks to hold these people up because they need help. And I love that idea.
Colin, my PhD is in positive psychology, and one of the founding fathers of the modern positive psychology movement was Christopher Peterson. He died a few years ago, but the phrase that he was best known for, after analysing a century of research into psychology and what leads to a life well lived, it just harmonises so beautifully with the shipwreck metaphor, and it's just 3 words: other people matter. When I hear you describe this grief process and how you worked through it, there's just this one word that keeps coming up, and that is community, community, community. It's other people who matter. Yeah. I discovered that, how important it was to me in grief to have the community. And then I also, just building on that idea that you just said about a life well lived, is, Viktor Frankl was meaningful to me. I read his book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he talks about the idea that we find meaning in other people, outside of ourselves. So how are we of service to other people? That you can't just think about your own needs and desires and find meaning that way. It's how you are in relation to other people. And that's also was very crystallizing to me. There's something as well, as I think about this process, we've very much focused on you and your grief, but as an outsider, a friend of the family, a loved one, somebody who is going through my own personal grief about the tragedy, but also wanting so desperately. I mean, anyone who's not you wants so desperately to offer support however they can. There's a clumsiness, there's an awkwardness, there's an unsureness about it. But by being open and by actually reaching out and saying, you look like a plank of wood that I could lean on for a moment, in so many ways you provide purpose and meaning. It sort of ties in with that Frankl idea. When we shut ourselves off, not only do we harm ourselves, but we also reduce the capacity that others have to find meaning and purpose and goodness in their lives through the same grief that we're all experiencing.
Yeah, I love that.
Just a thought that came to me.
I think you're right. I think that people were and are desperate to help Gail and I, and it can be awkward and difficult, because I think I've spoken to many people in grief, and oftentimes people say, like, I'll do anything for you, whatever you want. But in the early days, we don't know what we want. And we feel lost, and it's almost a burden for us to, like, think of things you could do for me. Like, I don't know what you can do for me. I got to think about that. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to live right now, so I can't think about what you could do for me. But when people gave specific offers, like, hey, would you like to go for a walk tomorrow in a park? I'm available. That was very helpful.
How hard was it to say yes? Like, you must have wanted to say, no, I want to sit here and cry.
Yes. Yeah. So I talk about that in the book. I actually, I was finding myself saying no a lot because it was very hard for me to make a decision. And it was very hard for me to even think about the next hour, let alone tomorrow. Like someone says, oh, I'll go for a walk with you tomorrow. I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to feel tomorrow. I can't make a commitment to that. I don't know if I'll be out of bed. I don't know what's going to happen. But I found that because I really want to be with people in community, and I imagined that I would want to have a conversation with this person. So I just started saying yes to everything. That was my new policy. I wanted to say no. I just said yes. And it was a way of staying engaged in life. Even when I didn't want to be engaged in life, I trusted that a sort of fake it till I make it kind of vibe. You know what I mean? Like, do I really want to go for a walk? No, but I know that walking can be helpful and healthy, and I'm going to say yes, and I'm going to do it. And sure enough, as I'm walking, I'm discovering, oh, I'm glad I took the walk. You know what I mean? And I kind of trusted in that. I sort of trusted that meaning and purpose would come back to me, because life feels meaningless. When you lose something, when you have a profound loss and your identity is shook, life feels meaningless. Because what matters, why does it matter what I do in my life? Ruby and Hart aren't here to share that with me. But ultimately, I think by just trusting that it would come back to me and engaging in life, it has. I think I have found meaning and purpose in life, even in their absence.
My wife's history is partly New Zealand Maori, or Māori, as she would say. They have a tradition where a person dies and that person's body stays in the family home or on what they call the marae. And there are 3 days where the entire family stays with the body of the deceased.
Wow.
When this was first explained to me, Colin, I was probably in my early 20s and frankly, I was horrified. I really liked the standard Western way of keeping your distance. Death apparently is quote unquote disgusting. And yet over time, I've fallen in love with the idea, so much so that I'm looking forward to the opportunity to celebrate the lives of Kylie's family in that way. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that we can even adopt some of that in our own family. Reading about the Jewish way of going through the traditions that you described, it also shifted me even further into wanting those deep and profound traditions around death and grieving, especially with community. Do you have any sense of where the idea comes from that we're supposed to push grief away?
Yeah, I think there's several reasons why this has sort of become our cultural default to avoid grief, avoid the discomfort of grief. I'm still thinking about your wife's traditions, which just seems so beautiful. And I feel like I just want to respond quickly to your wife's traditions. The idea that I think there's a lot of cultural heritage that we all have that involves engaging in grief, and it's somehow easy to short circuit that stuff.
Right.
So I know lots of people, Shiva is supposed to last 7 nights, but many people don't do that. Many Jews don't do that. There are a lot of traditions in the Jewish culture about grief and mourning that people do. Yeah, that's what we're supposed to do, but we're going to do a shorter version. You know what I mean? We're not really going to do that, and that's true for Islam as well. And in Christianity, there are lots of traditions we have around grief that I think as a culture we shortchange and think like, yeah, that's what we're supposed to do, but it doesn't feel right. And in a way, giving ourselves over to these cultural traditions can be really beautiful because it is uncomfortable. To your point, why is grief so avoided now? Is because I think it's so uncomfortable. And it seems like it's easier to avoid it, but in fact it's not, because we don't get to avoid grief. It happens to all of us, no matter what. We're all going to grieve, and it's okay to feel pain. I think that people don't like the idea of people being in pain. They want to speed it up, right? Like that's why people are encouraged to get over it, because they're making people uncomfortable. I'm seeing you're in pain. I'm uncomfortable. So I say, cheer up, stop grieving. But in fact, there's nothing wrong with the pain of loss. It's a beautiful pain. It comes from love. The reason it hurts so bad is because I love them so much. And isn't that a beautiful thing? Don't we want to love people? Don't we want to open our hearts up to both sides of love, the joyful feelings and then also the aching. Why close ourselves off to that? But I think people are afraid of it and think that it's somehow more convenient to not feel that pain.
You speak so vulnerably and so beautifully. I just so appreciate what you've shared. I have just a couple of other questions, and then we'll bring this to a close. In the book, page 176, you share a quote from Helen Keller. It's always been a personal favourite of mine, but I didn't have the full context for the quote. And the way you use it in the book is just so, I think, so helpful. I want to say so delightful, but that word feels a little bit inappropriate in the conversation. And yet my mind exploded in wonderful ways when I read it. Would you mind reading that and perhaps sharing why this matters so much?
Yeah, absolutely. So Helen Keller wrote, "Security is mostly a superstition. It does not exist in nature, nor do the children of men as a whole experience it. Avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than outright exposure. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing." And I was first introduced to this quote from Ruby. She was at an OCD group, an adult OCD group. She was so precocious at engaging that even as a 16-year-old and 17-year-old, she was a member of this adult OCD group. And she was a leader in this group, by the way. So she was an extraordinary person. And she brought this quote home because it really talks about exposing oneself to danger. And a lot of elements of OCD are about trying to control danger. So not all, but a lot of people with OCD, their obsessive compulsive behaviors are about trying to keep people safe. If I do this, I will forestall something bad from happening. And in a way, part of the therapy, very often for OCD is saying, well, what if something bad did happen? Like, let's expose yourself to that and try and sit with that discomfort. We're not in control. We're not actually safe. And can we open ourselves up to that? So this is a quote that was important to Ruby, and she stuck it on her corkboard in her room. And I knew about it. And then I discover it in grief. And I'm like, oh, right. Yeah. None of us are safe. None of us are in control. Horrible things happen all the time to people who are innocent, who couldn't have been protected. Wars, crashes, all sorts of terrible diseases strike people, and it's all unfair. And we can't protect ourselves from it. And yet, do we want to live a life that's like hunkered down and trying to protect ourselves from these things that we can't protect ourselves from? Or do we want to open ourselves up to it and try and engage in life and the adventure of life? And so it became an inspirational quote for me to help me stay engaged in life, even though it's scary.
I asked you to elaborate on that because my final question for you really ties in with what you're describing. Life is a daring adventure, or is nothing, and yet my two children are no longer with me. And for me to live that daring adventure, in some ways, I don't know if this is probably the wrong word to use, but there's this sense of, I've got to get over this. Or certainly there are people who expect that we have to get over this. My understanding, though, is that you never get over losing your two children, having them taken from you, especially like this. In conclusion, how are you now?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Because sometimes it's scary to ask me, right? How am I doing? I think it's scary to people. But I always appreciate people checking in. And it is all an ongoing struggle. I don't like to use the word healing because to my mind, I'll never heal. Ruby and Heart, I have holes in my heart, two large holes in my heart. They aren't going anywhere. But I'm living around them. So I'm still, my heart's not, it's damaged, but it still works. I still love people. I want to be open to life. And so early on after the crash, for example, I said to Gail, we could be parents again. We could foster adopt. And one of the reasons why I had that idea was because Ruby put it in my mind. A year or two before she was killed, she said to us, we should foster adopt. And we're like, what? How do you even know? But you're like a 15-year-old kid. How do you even know about foster adopting? Because she's just that kind of kid. She did research on it. And she said, there's so many children in Los Angeles County that need families, and we're a loving family. And we should bring some into our family. And we thought that's such a beautiful idea. And I thought at the time, my hands are full. I got 2 kids. That's beautiful, Ruby, but no. And then suddenly I was like, oh, wow, right. I've got 2 empty bedrooms, and maybe we could bring children into our lives and continue to parent. And it was difficult. So I said this to Gail, and she burst into tears and said, thank God you said that. I was thinking that too, but I was scared that you would be too scared to try again with other kids. Wow. And so we embarked on this journey. So it's a difficult journey, and you have to take classes. You have to be trained to do this. And mostly the training is about learning about trauma. These kids have endured terrible trauma. That's why they're in the foster system. No kid in the foster system doesn't have trauma. That's how they got there, through no fault of their own, right? It was we tried to foster. I talked about in the book, we started fostering to adopt a teenage girl, 13-year-old girl, and she lived with us for 1.5 years. And I thought we were making a new family. But in fact, she found it hard to open her heart up to the idea of being part of a family. For her, family meant trauma. For her, opening her heart meant vulnerability, and that was catastrophic for her in the past. And even though she wanted to have a new family, she couldn't do it. It was too scary for her. And ultimately, she said, I want out. I don't want to be adopted. I want to age out of the system, which is very bleak statistically, and heartbreaking that she wasn't able to just hang in there with us a little longer until she could acclimate and see that it was safe. But we're trying again, and I think it's going very well. So we have a 13-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter. They're siblings, and it feels good in so many ways to be parenting, to have a family. It's a real stretching of the heart. But it's also challenging because here I am still in grief, and they have lots of trauma and grief of their own that they're trying to process, but they're just a kid, So I have my adult experiences and perspectives, but they're just kids struggling with these terrible feelings of loss and trauma. So it's like parenting on steroids. But it's very meaningful to me and Gail.
Colin, so grateful for what you've shared. So grateful for the, I want to say inspiration, but again, I'm not sure that's the right word. All I can really think of to do, though, is to express my appreciation, my gratitude. Speaking about these things is, I'm sure, a combination of both incredibly difficult and incredibly joyful. And the way you've done that is a wonderful honor to you and your family, and especially to Ruby and Hart. Thank you so much for sharing what you have with us on the podcast today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
I so appreciate Colin Campbell joining me for that conversation. As I mentioned at the outset, my nephew died on Sunday night last week by suicide. He was the most energetic and delightful kid that I know. He was kind and fun, laughed all the time. My kids, his cousins, loved hanging out with him, and as his uncle, I loved hanging out with him too. I remember last year we surfed at Kira when the surf was as good as it gets, well overhead, absolutely pumping, because surfing was his thing. He was so good at it. He was close to pro. He was staying at my parents' house the night that he took his life. My mum and dad, his nan and pop, found him on the Monday morning. They found him too late to help. They found him too late to do anything except scream no. They found him too late for him to hear them as they cried his name over and over and over again. Logan, Logan, Logan. How do you hold the body of your grandson for the last time. That was what my parents did that Monday morning. How do you call your daughter, still celebrating a special weekend with her husband in Melbourne, and tell her that she needs to come home because her son, just 20 years old, has died? That was also what my parents did on Monday morning last week. And then we received the call, and then we sat with each of our children, and the ripple effect of those conversations carried and carried and carried. In a Facebook post last week, I said this: here's what I want you to know. There are 9 suicides every single day in Australia. 7 of those 9 suicides each day are men. 2 of those 9 are women. And suicide is the leading cause of death among young people 15 to 24 years. 36% of deaths in this age group are suicides. Now, it's a complex issue, and rarely is there just one factor that leads to someone taking their own life. But here's what we do know. Strong social connections reduce the chance of suicide. So please, 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 please be kind. Be compassionate, be gentle, be inclusive, be supportive, be less critical and judgmental, and be more of a cheerleader. Don't be on your kids' back. Instead, make sure you've got their back. Love them and make sure that they know it. They have to know they matter. This is a hard conversation to have. I hope that my discussion with Colin Campbell and the way that I've shared with you today has been helpful. Please hug your kids, hug your husband, your wife, your spouse, your partner, and share this message and this love with everyone you know that needs to know how much they matter. If you need help, call Lifeline 13 11 14. The suicide callback service is 1300 659 467. Men's Line Australia is 1300 789 987. And Kids Helpline 1-800 55 1-800.